Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar, How to Deaccession Your Work and Focus on Your Mission. A little bit about me. I'm the founder and director of Relicura, 20 years in museums and archives and working with collections management and managers. In addition to being a business owner and consultant, I'm also an author, speaker, and people first advocate. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First, bullet that's not on this, but I did want to note we have increased the volume, hopefully, on this video. So hopefully you are hearing me a bit louder than the previous webinars, but of course, please let us know. Getting into the bullet points now, a link to this recording and links to all resources mentioned will be sent via email the next day. So don't worry about trying to scribble down the links if you're enjoying the webinar. And they'll be shared in the chat too if you're following along in the chat box there. This session is pre-recorded, and that's so I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you. It also allows me the opportunity to answer any follow-up questions you may have that you can pose in the chat. Speaking of that chat box, we use the YouTube platform. And so if you've got a YouTube or Google account, if you sign in, you're able to use that chat box. If so, please feel free to share any examples, resources, any questions you may have on the content that we're covering today. And we'll answer those or comment on those as needed. And then we are using YouTube, so you get all of the typical YouTube tools in terms of being able to turn on closed captioning, being able to expand the video in size depending on the device you're watching this particular video on. So we have all of the typical YouTube player tools available. And then just please remember and respect that this is my content and intellectual property. Unless otherwise noted, we do have a couple citations in here sending you to some other resources. Oh, and just a quick disclaimer, because we will talk just a little bit on mental health and some non-professional stuff as it relates to our professional lives, of course. And just to know, I'm not a medical professional. Obviously, I am a subject matter expert, just like yourselves. So any content here is shared and intended to provide guidance and helpful resources. And of course, speak with your doctor. All right, quick contents. The introduction, we're going to spend some time talking about the degrowth paradigm, especially because it's an economic concept. We'll define it first and then talk about how we can apply it in our current frame of reference for archives and museums. We'll then get into how to identify high impact activities, just because that can help inform what we cut or what we don't in terms of prioritization and current workload. We'll get into how to create a personal collecting mission. So having that be informed and of course being able to use that collecting mission to make decisions on what activities and projects we keep and what are ones that we perhaps should be deaccessioning. And then lastly, once we've got all of those foundational components in place, we will talk about how to apply the degrowth, or AKA deaccessioning paradigm, to our concept of collecting mission and sort of deaccessioning those activities, applying it to us as human beings versus applying deaccessioning to collections. If you want deaccessioning about collections, that was last month's webinar. And so of course you can go check it out over at YouTube after today's webinar. Okay, let's get into it. So introduction and degrowth paradigm stuff. To set the stage, so to speak, our current reality, we are often in institutions that are underfunded, and in those institutions, because they're underfunded and for other reasons, often there are not enough staff to do all of the various things that the museums and archives both need to do but also want to do. And as such, we are often overworked and overwhelmed. Additionally, the roles that we play, the work that we do as collection workers, is often misunderstood and undervalued. And that is from an internal perspective of just other people in our organization, as well as external perspective of any of those external stakeholders in terms of what they view of our collection, that work, and of course ourselves as those professionals who do that work. And we're burnt out. So for the two bullet points listed above, for those reasons and for many other reasons, we are burnt out. If you are interested in burnout, we do have a video dedicated entirely to being burnt out. So if you need some support around that, we do have that too. So thinking about, in this context, this particular resource is museum focused, but of course the concept and essentially what is happening is not just specific to museums, but also archives and cultural heritage institutions. I did a blog post for Lucidia that is a report and further interpretation on the Museum Trends Watch report. If you're not familiar, Museum Trends Watch is put out annually by the American Alliance of Museums, specifically their Center for Future of Museums. And each year they put out a forecast essentially of big issues or challenges or opportunities of the day. And in this particular flavor, they are talking about museums being built on capitalist and for-profit models and how that ultimately is not serving us as museums and larger organizations, but also us as human beings, both working in and being patrons and enjoying of those museums. So the link here currently is to the blog post I created with interpretation and further analysis. But of course, also you can check out the actual Trends Watch report, which is the link in this current slide. So essentially, for that particular Trends Watch area, it discusses the director of the Center for the Future of Museums, Elizabeth Merritt, discusses how museums have been based on the capitalist model, at least over here in the United States, and that we as museum workers, even at the executive level, typically don't take a minute to think and realize that. It's not been a point of discussion for many years and in many circles for museums at least. And because museums are built on this capitalist model, the values, then the metrics, the decisions being made at the business level for museums are all centered around the concept of for-profit. So what are those for-profit values? And that is the consideration of power, productivity, and the economic side or metrics that we can establish quantitatively and that we use as markers of success. This seems completely contrary, of course, to the work that we do, why museums and archives exist in the first place, what ultimately our missions are, and of course our jobs as individuals. And so there's a large amount of dissonance and disconnect with our organizations being set up in a capitalist model, but yet none of our actual values or the work that we do is a match for that type of model. Which brings us into degrowth. So degrowth wasn't introduced, at least from my recollection, in that Trends Watch report. However, it is a concept, an economic concept that has started to make its way into nonprofits as we analyze and assess what is working and what is not working, particularly from a financial perspective. So the concept of degrowth as the economic paradigm provides a critique on the global capitalist system, and that particular system is one that pursues growth at all costs. So it can cause and further human exploitation, it can cause and further exacerbate environmental destruction, all towards the aim of being productive and essentially bringing in more money. It's the financial metric of success. So degrowth and that particular paradigm means the transforming of each of our societies, and in this case, the United States, to help ensure environmental justice and to help ensure that there's good life quality, no exploitation happening of human beings. So it's really decentering or taking the economic financial metric of success, deprioritizing that in favor of ultimately prioritizing what is good and for the well-being of all, and essentially being a people first sort of paradigm in addition to the environment, which ultimately benefits all people too. So they're connected there, but for the economic paradigm, they really do mention those two specifics: environmental justice and the well-being of humans. So whether you like and your brain can really get around the concept of degrowth, or if you prefer the concept of deaccession, which is perhaps a little bit more familiar for us in museum and archives world, the deaccession that we're going to use as defined here is to deaccession and permanently remove. The intention is permanent removal, not weeding. Permanent removal of an item or items from a collection. And in this case, if we're applying deaccession to our work, then it's the deaccession of activities because they do not pertain to that collecting mission. Because of course, deaccession is a normal part of collections management and is a normal activity that typically takes into account the collecting mission of the institution, and that it is an important part to managing and further developing health and vitality of the remaining collection. And in this case, we are the collection. If we're creating our collecting mission for ourselves and our work, deaccessioning will help the betterment and health of our role and our work. To further talk about deaccession or degrowth, again, whichever one your brain prefers, engaging in those activities will help to protect the diminished resources that we are facing, both as people who work within a larger system, those diminished resources, as well as the diminished resources on a more personal capacity level. Again, we're feeling burnt out, stressed, health issues, not enough time to do everything. Like there's a lot happening. So diminished resources for in the workplace as well as within ourselves. And it can help prove and increase our value to stakeholders, with the intention or the result being, if we are deaccessioning activities that are not in service of our collecting mission, then we are then able to focus on, dedicate more resources towards, prioritize better the activities and projects that we should be doing that are of the best and better betterment of everyone, in this case, stakeholders, everyone to our place of work. And so the question is, how can we deaccession activities in our work life? And that ultimately is the setup for us as we move into this webinar, talking about how to identify high impact activities, how to then identify through thought prompts our personal collecting mission as it comes to our work, and then ultimately, what is that deaccession or degrowth criteria based on this discovery we've gone through. So our next section is about how to identify high impact activities. And while there is a bit of a financial component to this, and may seem sort of in contradiction to the degrowth paradigm of somewhat of an anti-capitalist, not that they use that phrase, sort of perspective, but it is one of the criteria that I think can help inform the activities that we decide to either prioritize or not. So high activities for us in the museum and archives world precipitates a raise or increase of financial contributions, as well as brand awareness. In this case, brand could be the organization itself as well as the collection. It can increase stakeholder loyalty because we're doing more in service of and prioritizing their needs. And then it has the other effect of increasing and raising that community interest and support. And this is sort of a natural effect of support because, again, if we're prioritizing the people and taking that human-centered approach, taking that focus of how are we best in service of those people in our community, then it will naturally help to cultivate more interest and support. In order to further define what could be high impact activities, then we take a look at and need to gather some data points. So areas where we could gather data that fall sort of into those 4 bullet points we just covered could be revenue generating events, taking a look at the mission and strategic plan of your organization. As we're focusing on our work, taking a look at our job description. Hopefully everybody has at least a position description from which they can start with. Taking a look at attendance and viewership, and I do want to emphasize this is not just the physical attendance and viewership, but also digital, as many of our collections are online now. Taking a look at engagement and use, and that again has an in-person or online component. It can help by gathering information about press and just other awareness examples or demonstrations. And then any sort of intangible other. And this can fall in not just the quantitative realm of gathering data, but also the qualitative. As much of our work tends to lend more qualitative results, gathering both is important and can help balance your data and then ultimately your decision. In terms of defining high impact from more of like that person angle versus organization in general, when we are gathering that kind of data, we want to do it through a lens of the work that we do and how that work impacts or not those types of activities. So we want to think about the activities and projects that are meaningful to us. That's an important aspect because we are human beings, and part of why we're in this field is because we love it. And we can derive some tremendous satisfaction from the work that we do. So that is an important aspect to the work that we're talking about today. We also want to take a look at the areas where we have agency or the ability to determine our work. Having agency, ability to make decisions, ability to self-determine are important aspects of maintaining a healthy professional setting and can help ward off the concepts of burnout and overwhelm. And then we also want to think about activities or projects that aid in your career growth. So us as individuals, this is a highly professionalized industry. And so activities, projects, skills that we learn, things that we do in our role currently can help grow us and invest in us as professionals in this industry and further our careers ultimately. So again, thinking about this personal angle, us as people in our work, getting a definition of high impact and what it means for us, in addition to, in that previous slide, defining high impact activities from that organizational perspective. I maintain or would argue that both of these aspects are incredibly important, especially if we are hoping to maintain a good work-life balance, maintain better mental health, especially within the workplace. So we do want to have both aspects here when we're talking about analyzing and potentially deaccessioning part of the work that we are doing or being asked to do. So then based on those items, we want to think about the protected activities. So high impact, again, thinking about what brings in financial contributions, what raises brand awareness, what could increase stakeholder loyalty, and what could further perpetuate and cultivate that community interest and support. And then thinking about what does our work do that supports those areas, and which projects or activities specifically does our work do to help support those areas. So maintaining personal, like what helps us, makes us feel more satisfied, but also what ultimately helps our museum, keeps our museum healthy, and our community that we serve. And then what remains? Once you've sort of jotted down and answered the thought prompts from the previous couple of slides, what activities remain that you are currently doing that did not make it into either that personal angle and lens or what is ultimately helping to support the museum and your community? This will be an initial and very helpful indicator in terms of what are you being asked to do or what are you currently doing that maybe isn't as important. If it's not serving you as an individual professional, if it's ultimately not serving your organization, then we do need to ask the question, why are we doing it? Okay, our next section is how to create a personal collecting mission. So we've covered some of the high impact activities in terms of what it means to our organization and our community. as well as what it means to ourselves as individual human beings and professionals. And now we'll get into a few more reflective questions to help us evaluate and unearth what it is that are activities and projects that we do that have the most value for us and that should be a part of our collecting mission, or AKA our job or life mission. So defining your collecting mission, thinking about high impact activities, what we just covered in the last section. Which activities are critical for you to do? So of all of the things in your organization and in all of the things under your own particular department umbrella, what are the activities or projects that are critical for you yourself with your knowledge and skill set to do? Which activities provide profound satisfaction, so that make you as an individual satisfied, feel joy, brings peace, however you define your own satisfaction as an individual and a professional. And which activities bring you joy and or are restorative? So things that, in addition to any sort of career satisfaction or happiness, what brings you as the individual on a personal level joy, what restores you or re-energizes you as an individual, so that you can bring that into your work and into your home life. We're going to go through a few different sections, and these next two slides are going to include prompts for you to think about. For some of these, you may have immediate answers. For others of these, it may take you a while to sort of think about or journal through, however your brain works best. But they're all designed to be prompts to help you get at least a few answers to what work means for you, what is satisfying, what is work of value, and however you choose to define value, and ultimately how it can help inform your collecting mission. So for reflection, there are the following prompts. What's been on the perpetual to-do list? What work helps you feel fulfilled? What work do you avoid or put off? How is your schedule and routine working for you? Do you have enough time in the day? How does your body feel most days? How does your mental energy feel most days? And how do you feel mentally and emotionally? So you'll notice while some of the prompts ask you about how you're feeling at work and what sort of particular activities help make you feel fulfilled or the opposite, we're also making sure that we're covering prompts that have you check in with how you are doing mentally, emotionally, and physically. Because of course, the space in our mind and how we think of things, how we interpret things, how we experience things, all have an impact on ultimately our health in the various ways our health can manifest. Next up is to assess. So thinking through prompts to help you assess what is happening, what you're currently doing, and helping to inform some future work. Prompts being, what work doesn't need to be done? It's a would be nice. What work can wait until there's better support? What work is crucial for you to do? And look at the time you have available and the work you need to slot in from your to-do list. Does the math make sense? So you'll notice some of the prompts echo our first set of reflections, where it's asking you to think through the things that are essential for you to do, whether you have enough time in the day to do them, kind of thing. And now we're getting into that assessment piece of, yes, does the math actually make sense when you compare your to-do list and how long things take compared to how many hours you have in a day? What things from an assessment perspective is absolutely crucial for you to do, because there can be a difference sometimes in when we reflect and how we feel. Things can be critical for us to do versus in reality. So asking you to take a bit more of a critical lens, or as much as possible, an external view of assessment on these particular prompts. And ultimately, when you go through this work, what remains may still be too much for one person. That, in fact, can be incredibly common in the field that we are in. And when that is the case, the operations of the organization and your role need to be radically reconsidered, because as much as we would love to still do more or be as helpful as we can be and serve the organization, there are only so many hours in the day. And the more we are overcommitted, overworked, overwhelmed, and burnt out, that compounds and in the end is disastrous for all of us involved, including the institution. So while it is certainly admirable and there's certainly that culture of perpetual sacrifice present in many nonprofits, including museums and archives, ultimately is not sustainable. And so we need to make sure that if the math is not working out in the number of things we have to do in the day versus the actual number of hours and days that we have, then we need to reconsider what is happening, both on the human level at our individual job, but also broader in the organization. Because chances are, if you are currently tasked with doing way too much for one person, that is likely to be chronic throughout the institution and needs to be addressed. Prune. So doing some pruning of activities, maybe not necessarily a full deaccessioning or degrowth, but really trying to, in a first gentle approach, pruning some things that may not need to be happening, at least on a temporary basis. So prompts being which activities, responsibilities, or tasks are not your job, which activities, responsibilities, or tasks are essential for you to do, which activities, responsibilities, or tasks reasonably fit into a 1 FTE or full-time employment position, and what can be left behind or distributed elsewhere. So taking some of that assessment work that you did and what you've identified through your reflection process, helping to walk you through, of all of those, a second sort of vetting and what can be sort of pruned or rescoped, perhaps paused or scaled down enough where it can help you fit into that, number of hours in the day, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 or what have you. And then, of course, can there be some distribution of things? Ultimately, if we can't stop or pause doing things, are there other things that can be shouldered by multiple people so that it is not such a burden on one person? Rethink. So you've gone through reflection and assessment, pruning some of the things that we can. We also need to be aware of and have opportunity to rethink what it is that we're doing on a daily basis, as well as annually in our jobs. Prompts being rethink everything that doesn't feel good. So while there are things that we do because it's our job, there are probably things in there that do not feel as good, do not make us as career satisfied, or do not bring us joy. And so ultimately, we need to rethink if those are necessary, or at least at the cadence that they are currently. Next, radically reconsider your schedule, routines, commitments, and activities. For many of us, myself included, if I get into a routine, it's easier for my brain just to stick with that routine instead of rethinking, like, do I really need to do that? Or is there perhaps a better and more efficient way to do that? Do I really need to do that as frequently as I'm doing it? And so pausing and considering, like, do you need to have all those various commitments? Are there efficiencies that we can make in terms of what are some of the things that you're doing? Is there a better schedule for you, depending on whether that is like overall project schedule or like a daily to weekly schedule? And ultimately, what sort of activities need to be in place, and whereas others can be rethought of, or even if the activity is happening, maybe there's a different or better way we can do it. And then perform major pruning or deaccessioning of people, places, and activities that no longer serve you. So of course, this has a bit of a work and a personal component. You can, of course, deaccession in both sides of your life. But ultimately thinking about, are there things that aren't essential for you, that don't bring you career satisfaction or joy? Do they even really need to be present? And maybe that means that you, don't serve on that voluntary committee. Or maybe that means that of some of these activities, instead, maybe a volunteer can do them on a less frequent basis. So really rethinking some of the stuff that is certainly causing you delays or being blockers to you doing some of the other work that is perhaps more important or more valuable. Protect, thinking about what are your limited resources. And for any human being, there are typically four very important and yet very restricted resources. The first restricted resource is time. We all are allotted the same amount of time, and it doesn't matter what we do with it, it still passes just as quickly. We only have so much energy, so mental, emotional, physical energy. We only have so much throughout the day, let alone throughout the year. Our health, whatever our health is currently, and of course, our health can be impacted for good or for worse, depending on what is happening both in our work and our personal life. And then how many fucks, and apologies for the PG-13 rating of this webinar, but how much care do you have? Like, we can only care about so many things, or we can only give a fuck about so many things, that we ultimately need to be intentional with the areas that we pour our care into. So really having some critical reflection and then protection of areas where you do want to give a fuck, and areas where, like, no, you really don't need to care about this one, at least not as actively anymore. And thinking about that a bit further, because these are limited resources, we need to make sure that there are not people, places, or events that are taking away from or sucking away those types of resources. For example, one of the pop culture terms is energy vampire. So you can have certain friends or family members where when you interact with them, they're an energy vampire and they suck like all of the good energy out of you when you have a social interaction with them. Similar concept. There are people, places, and things, events that we feel like we have to do out of obligation, we should do, which is part obligation, part like shame society, things that, yes, we do really need to do, that we're ultimately responsible for, things that we want to do, all of those flavors, making sure that we're being intentional, that it is, if those things take up resources, are they worth the resources that they cost? We want to make sure we are protecting people, places, and activities that are restorative to you. So while our resources are finite, they can to some extent be replenished. Sometimes they can be replenished through straightforward taking a nap, eating healthy meals, taking a walk outside. Like, there are things that restore you in various mental, physical, and emotional ways. The same can be true depending on your brain and the type of person you are. Sometimes there are people, places, and activities that are specific for you that help to restore you. And so making sure you get those in regularly so that you are replenished in your finite resources to continue on living the kind of life and doing the kind of activities that you want to do. And then protect your ability and capacity to dedicate to people, places, and activities that you give a fuck about, because that's ultimately the point of life, right? Doing the things that mean the most to us, caring for the people who mean the most to us, and showing up in ways that do cost time, energy, and amount of care that we have. So while we want to protect our finite resources, replenish them when possible, both of those go hand in hand to ultimately being able to spend those finite resources on the people, places, and things that we care the most about. And that is true in our workplace as well as true in our personal life. So ultimately, if you remember one thing, I want you to remember this. If you are spending your resources on the people, places, and things that you ultimately don't value, it impacts your ability to engage with the people, places, and things that you do value. So making unintentional decisions or doing things without much intention, draining your resources, will ultimately impact your ability to put resources in the places that really matter to you. And while sometimes that's okay and that's life and that happens, ultimately, for our sustained happiness and health, we need to make sure that we are being intentional with making sure we have the finite resources that we need to put in and pour into the things that we value most. And fortify. So making sure we've gone through assess, prune, and protect. and protection, especially of finite resources, that's in place. We need to think about engaging in deep rest when our body asks for it. And this is important whether work is extremely crazy and hectic or there's things going on in your personal life. In order to be in a period of sustained working hard or stressful mode, we need to make sure we're matching that with a deep rest mode. I also recommend adopt regular physical and mental health therapies. So whatever it is that works best for your body or your brain, to try and get those in for for both. Whatever activities those look like on a somewhat regular basis. Our bodies and brains work the best when they can anticipate and expect certain therapies or restorative measures at a regular pace. So whatever it is you decide to do, try and do it somewhat regularly. And then acquiring places of joy and peace. So hopefully you already have a couple places that you can think of that bring you joy and or peace. And if not, well, even if you do have a couple, adding a few more is never a bad thing. So finding those so that you have them when you need them, when you need some of that replenishment or you need that peaceful restorative break, that you have those identified. And when we're fortifying stuff, we have to earn and accumulate our resources in order to spend them. So that's part of what the fortifying is about. This can be a slow process, of course, which is why that protection piece is like step number one. Fortifying our resources is also critical, though, and that second part to how we function. So just, again, remembering you can't spend what you don't have. And finally, investing. In our investment, we're investing in resources, we're investing in ourselves, and in that regard, investing in a way where we can show up to our best extent in work, but also in our life in general. And I recommend upgrading your life with better systems, routines, and tools, whatever that looks like for you. If it makes your life like a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient, if it takes away some of the brain drain, by all means, get it in there. Cultivate your expertise in areas where you find satisfaction and that make your job easier. So for us, especially since we're in a field that we typically choose to enter into because we love it, we do have the benefit of that, of having sort of an abundance of different opportunities, whether it's webinars or attending conferences. Maybe it's deep diving into a niche area of research in our particular field. Finding and investing some of your time and energy in those areas can ultimately be both a restorative activity as well as helping to invest in broadening your satisfaction overall, helping to make your job easier, which creates different benefits. So multi-benefit there. Build your career through specific service that is meaningful to you and with organizations that you care about. For most of us, when we're in the field, there's a certain amount of professional service that we do, community service in terms of serving on committees at various different professional organizations or maybe within our institution, all in an effort to give time and energy and skills and expertise to help better something. And while that is an expenditure of those resources, if we're thoughtful about where we place those, that placement of resources can instead be viewed as an investment. Next, grow your network of peers and trusted colleagues beyond your organization. For many of us, it's usually never an instance of where you start your careers, where you are ending your career with no in between. And so having that healthy network is helpful both from a job career perspective, as well as creating a bit of a support network, which can be critical to navigating particularly turbulent times in your organization, is being able to connect with peers and professionals outside of your organization. And find internal and external allies in causes you care about and build on your affinities. And so as we think of, reflect, identify on things that help to restore us, areas where we want to make sure we're investing, it is very important for us to identify other allies in the cause and ultimately pulling resources together with those allies on causes that you care about. That helps from a efficiency perspective in terms of making sure you're investing resources in areas where they have the best chance to flourish. But it's also great in terms of, again, building that supportive community for yourself, whether that is needing support to stay at your current organization or needing support to help leave your current organization. So with all of that in mind, thinking through those various thought prompts, doing that assessment, doing some pruning thought prompts, and ultimately thinking of how to take care of your finite resources, fortify, protect, and invest. Those will all help you to identify what is essentially, we're going to call it collecting mission because that's the term we're familiar with, but collecting mission for yourself. So in this particular case, we're focusing on your job, but of course, your collecting mission can really be your life mission and the things that you want to make sure that you focus on and highlight for how you live your life. So putting that all together, I recommend doing a my job is kind of statement. And as you, the things that you have identified for your job and your career, really articulating what are my critical responsibilities in regards to this job? What are the essential activities I perform? And what are the activities that are restorative, bring me joy, and are profoundly satisfying? In this particular case, we're talking about your job. Again, you can extrapolate out and make a life mission if you wish. However, for us, it's really narrowing down what is it that we absolutely have to do? What is it that is an essential activity as we define it and as we perform it? And then what are those activities that, yes, fit the mission of the organization and yes, fit in as part of our job, but have that added benefit of being, yes, it's our job, but it's also providing us joy, it's providing us further career satisfaction, and ultimately being a restorative aid for how we are feeling. And in summary, for your mission, we want it to make sure that it identifies what you value the most. We want to encourage you as you put this together to weigh your decisions, where these investments are going, and other items against your collecting mission, aka your values and your job, to see if it's a fit. So again, we're taking that concept of collecting mission and how we put potential collection acquisitions against it and be like, yes, this fits the mission, or no, we need to pass this does not fit. That's what we're asking you to do with this. As a result, we want to periodically reassess your collecting mission and your actual collection, aka your life or your job if you want to keep it specific, and to make sure you're in alignment. And to deaccession, which is to cut out or decide against any activities that don't support your collecting mission. So this is very active in terms of once you establish this mission, going through as you would with a collecting mission and an actual collection, doing periodic updates, making sure that you're weighing any new potential activities or responsibilities against it, and deaccessioning accordingly of those that are no longer in service to your particular job or mission. All right, so when thinking of degrowth actions, and bringing us back to the beginning of the webinar when we talked about the Center for the Future of Museums Trend Watch report, there were 6 different actions that they suggested you could take under your particular, in this case, museum organization, to help establish or at least experiment and explore with these degrowth concepts. So I'm sharing them here because I think they could be applied and helpful at the organization level, but they may also be helpful to apply at your own personal level. So first is to consider the concept of right sizing. So right sizing means it's not necessarily like we grow and grow and grow and we only ever grow. Instead, perhaps it's that this organization should be of a certain size based on these certain amount of finite resources, and that means we only do these certain amount of things. And that can be applied to the museum, of course, but can be beneficial to yourself and your job, as well as the museum stakeholders. Number 2, engage the museum administration or whatever the governing authority looks like, and staff in an exploration of to define success. Again, thinking back to that article where the premise is museums are based on for-profit models and ultimately a capitalist model, and just how incongruous that is with the very nature of nonprofits and is in conflict with what we would originally say a museum's purpose is for. So it's challenging staff and ultimately the executive body in better defining what success looks like. Number 3, identify and adopt metrics for success that can foster more equitable and sustainable outcomes. So of this particular area, we want to make sure that as we're talking about success, that it's in alignment with what our values are, and that the activities that we're doing have metrics that make sense for us as humans performing the work, as well as activities that make sense for our community in the outcomes they produce. For number 4, we want to examine the museum's staff compensation policies to correct the likely underpayment or exploitative labor practices, such as perpetual term or contract labor for roles that should indeed be permanent full-time labor. And in that, again, challenging what it is that is valued and having that stop being the most about the bottom line, so to speak, in terms of finances, and more about how are we treating our humans? Are we valuing them? And to some extent, yes, that means that we value them quite literally and paying them not just living wages, but wages that are commensurate with their skills and experience. Number 5, contribute to a healthy and equitable economy through museum job creation. So we want to make sure that we have a healthy environment for our jobs, that there's salary transparency, that the compensation policies that we talked about in the previous bullet point are in play, and that if we are creating jobs, that we're doing so in a healthy manner to grow the economy in a healthier human-based way. And number 6, right sizing in a way that prioritizes equity and preserves heritage. So building and reiterating on that right size concept, and instead having to be very specific to that mission, which is typically something to do with preserving and sharing heritage. And for us as individuals, when we are engaging in degrowth or doing that deaccessioning process of things that do not serve us, we can do a cut, pause, or pass. Or excuse me, 4. There's cut, pause, pass, and delay. And for us, we can either cut the activities out as a whole. Those activities are either being given to somebody else or they are just not being done anymore. They don't need to be done. We can pause them, which is, okay, we've been doing them, but we're going to pause them for now. It doesn't make sense that we're doing them at this current cadence. Instead, it can be take a different form. So we're just pausing whatever it is currently. There can be a pass where maybe it's a new thing that's come up where it just makes sense for you to do necessarily, but perhaps a different colleague is interested in it or is a colleague that can take it on capacity wise. So instead passing that particular responsibility or activity over, or delay. If there's an activity that is only an activity you can do or only a responsibility that you can do, perhaps there's a delay in terms of when you do it or when you start that next project, so that it gives you a chance to figure out or finish and pass on other things on your plate before you take something else on. So essentially, as we're thinking about engaging in degrowth, all non-essential or AKA non-high impact activities are the ones that are being deaccessioned or at least downsized. That we want to limit any new or surprise projects on your plate. And if they are appearing, doing the cut, pause, pass, or delay tactics so that you can help right size and balance what it is on your work plate. And then, of course, anything that's not in your job description. If it's not currently in the job description and it needs to be, then your job description should be updated. If it's not currently in your job description and really shouldn't be, then we don't want it in there to begin with, and you shouldn't be doing those types of activities. So having those be sort of your 3 main frameworks for the degrowth and deaccession process. and some advice, because of course it is easy to say, yes, just deaccession those activities that don't bring you joy. It can be, of course, difficult in terms of everybody's feeling overworked. It can be difficult in terms of if somebody's asked you to do it and you genuinely want to be of help, but also you just have zero capacity to take one more thing on. There can be multiple reasons as to why it may be somewhat challenging to start implementing these sort of degrowth practices, but it is a practice. So practicing will help you get better. It will help you build that sort of muscle. But here's some advice to at least get you going. First, getting comfortable with the discomfort. I think for many of us in this field, it can be very hard for us to say no or let someone down or say no to an extra activity because we genuinely think the extra activity is a good idea, but we just cannot take it on. Realizing and knowing that no is a complete sentence. We can just say no. We don't really need to justify it or give an extra reason, unless, of course, it is with your boss and this is a constructive conversation of no, or maybe we need to trade in terms of balancing the workload. When we are doing degrowth and deaccessioning, pointing to our mission, so whether that is like literally the museum mission or your department mission, or the fact that this is your job and your job mission, being able to point to that in terms of being a realistic rubric of, no, that just doesn't fit my job currently. It doesn't make sense to take on. I'm going to pass. And thinking about if this, then that trade. So in some cases, there may not be much of an option for us to say no or to say, like, we've been doing this, but we're going to stop doing this. In which case, and when you're having that constructive conversation with whoever the higher up is, suggesting a negotiation in terms of, well, if we take this on, or if we continue to do this, then we can't take that on, or we need to stop doing or pause doing this other thing. So making sure that there's at least some sort of capacity change in order for you to continue doing or taking on whatever the thing is that you're being asked to. And also that it is an option to negotiate for more time, money, or resources. So some of those finite resources that your museum or archives could provide, if they're asking you to do more, or if in your evaluation you're finding that you're doing way too much, that more than you have the resources or capacity for, it is completely fair, and in many cases makes sense that you would need to ask for more time, more money, or whatever those resources look like for you. Speaking of resources of a different kind, there's a few different books that I would recommend just to help you further think through like the concept of the life mission or the job mission, helping assess in terms of, what makes you happy, how to more authentically identify with that, especially in a professional setting. And some of the other books that are just really great in terms of thinking through what's going on in our brains and how we show up in our personal professional lives. So I definitely recommend, if you're a book person, these are some of my favorites. And then we've covered a few different supportive topics to this area that are recorded webinars. So depending on what interests you, we have a Ask Me Anything Career Edition, which gets into some specifics about concepts we talked about today. We have the Burnt Out webinar, which part of this webinar is building off of that in terms of we are all in this state of burnout, which is why we need to do some degrowth. But the Burnout webinar is there in case you need to dig back into like the science of that and what's happening. We have the Hello Imposter webinar, which amazingly contributes to burnout and how we show up in our work life. So it could be a helpful one to go through. Project management, which we could all use more of in the museum and archives field. So if project management and those concepts are newer for you, it's a good webinar to check out. As we think about things that are valuable, like what work we do that has value, and us as collection workers and the value of our job, Strategies for how to capture and communicate the value of collection work is a good webinar for you. That will help you identify some specifics in terms of the high impact activities we spoke of, and then the less quantitative and more qualitative aspects of our work and how to capture those. And then finally, the what do we value and how do we measure it? So getting into the details a bit more in terms of what do we do in our daily work? How can we help to quantify that? Or perhaps better terms, what are the metrics for success in those specific areas? So of all of these, I recommend those last two, especially if you are having a challenge identifying what work is essential, what work has value, and how to communicate that as well to people who are not you, whether that is communicating up to your boss or externally to whichever party. Questions. We've got a couple specific questions before the webinar recording, so we'll include those now. Now is a good time for you to put questions into the chat box if you haven't already, because as we go through the questions, we'll then end the webinar just so that we can hopefully keep it under the hour mark for you and respect your time. So first question, what is the best way to handle burnout, the results from group work? I sometimes feel like I'm back in high school carrying a project for my entire group and then feeling frustrated and angry when my entire group receives praise for the work that I did alone. So my first question is, can we say no? Can we not? So to some degree asking you, is the group work assigned or is it somewhat voluntary? Because in which case, if it is somewhat voluntary, let's just stop doing it for a while, especially if the people who tend to end up in your type of group work are really just not pulling their weight. This kind of reminds me of my committee work in terms of, you're there to spend some of your finite resources, but not everybody is making that same commitment, in which case it's not a healthy environment to be in. If it's not up to you in terms of whether or not you participate in the group work, then trying a reframing of it and being very clear about what your role and contribution is. So for your particular question, I don't know the details, but if I'm to assume that some of this group work is happening like within your museum, then I would make sure that you're very clear when you talk about the work, whether that is informally with your boss or whether that is in context with your group, being very clear about what responsibilities of that group work were ones that you led or that you took on. And I would even engage with, when you're with that group, having a discussion about which parts are whose responsibility. Because ultimately, when it's a group setting, I find if there's not a specific name against a particular item, then that is the grayness and the fuzziness that allows people to make the benign or malicious assumption that just somebody else is going to take care of it. Especially if you've established a reputation of being the person who takes care of it, then unfortunately, they have learned that they don't need to be the ones to take that on. So a couple different strategies here in terms of to what extent do you have agency of being in these groups, and then if you do need to be in these groups, having some very specific and clear boundaries about what is just your responsibility and what is somebody else's responsibility to take on. When decisions have to be made in a group setting, I recommend doing it as a live meeting where everybody brings their pieces they're responsible for. The group makes decisions and then they go back and they do the things that they're responsible for. So keeping it very specific to, yes, we may be working as a group, but each person has their own thing they're responsible for, and I'm only going to be responsible for the things I need to be responsible for. And just being really clear and communicative in terms of what are the things that you are working on, especially with your boss or whomever it is that needs to know that. So I wish there was an easier answer in terms of like, just don't do group work. Of course, if it's up to you, then yeah, make that decision, don't do group work. But if it's not up to you, then trying to make it as tolerable and as specific and with boundaries as possible. Next question. How can I learn to accept idiosyncratic workflows within a museum library that largely ignores or takes for granted the expertise of archivists? Our archives and special collections team plays a very minor role in our digitization program, despite the fact that much of what gets digitized comes from our collections. It is very frustrating. So yeah, first of all, really hear and feel you on the unfortunate reality of larger institutions that, even though they're institutions built on specific areas of expertise, they seem to be the worst at acknowledging all of those areas of expertise, usually librarians and archivists. It is also extremely weird, but not uncommon, that a totally different department is digitizing what is ultimately a majority of your collection stuff. So, are there some wins we can make with compromise? So, thinking about the second, more specific part first, when we're talking about who's digitizing what, um, who's making those decisions, are there some conversations we can have with whatever that other department or person is, that can be helpful to both sides in terms of maybe they still do the digitizing, but can you inform what the priorities are, or provide them information on, look, these are our most in demand things. It makes sense work wise for us to digitize these, and also for our community because these are the most requested items. So I think having a conversation or series of conversations at that level, perhaps framed under the guise of how can we better support your work. And of course, there's the reverse where how can you better support our work in that type of framing. So approaching it from a curiosity perspective, but with an aim to hopefully have you both feel happy about what's happening and who's doing what. Um, Also thinking about the digitizing is happening somewhere else, that can be incredibly frustrating. But if we cannot get anywhere in a constructive manner, is there a possibility for like a bless and release? Like, of all of the things on your plate or the different concerns or different critical items that are for you to deal with, is this particular area one that's critical currently? If it's not, and again, this specific to the digitizing, we'll get to the first part in a minute, then maybe it's not something you worry about for the moment. Like, yes, still very frustrating in terms of how this has been set up at your organization. But depending on its ultimate impact on you and your staff, et cetera, maybe it's something, a fight for a different day or what have you. Coming back up to this first part, which of course, like is fundamentally harder because we are talking about these persons, or people are either ignorant in the sense of they are just not aware of what it is that you do, which seems silly, but maybe it's benign, maybe it's not malicious. Or the second one, where it is malicious, where they do conceptually know what you do, but they just don't value it. So in the first case, you can apply some gentle education and some gentle outreach in terms of the specifics of what you do, the value of what you bring, as the work professional, as well as the collection work itself. If it's the second one, then you're up against trying to change a person's mind, which is very hard to do, especially for adults. Our brains are just not as flexible anymore, and so that ultimately gets to, like, yes, you can still try gentle education to like bring them around, but for me it becomes more a game of containment and minimizing damage. So to what extent can we restrict the damage of this person and their beliefs, and instead do some other things over here to counteract? So for example, the largely ignores or takes for granted the expertise of archivists. So for me, like if it's the director that is doing that and has the malicious opinion, So it's not just the ignorance part. I would go and get allies from everywhere else, and I would preach the value and do gentle education and outreach everywhere else, not with this director, to sort of counteract whatever effect they're having. So, for example, if there's a celebration event coming up, your particular department does not have a seat at the table, even though it obviously should. Having allies in other areas that do get invited to that meeting with that executive director can help make sure that you are brought up in that conversation and ultimately included in the aspects they have control over. So it's not an easy answer, but if anybody does have an easy answer, by all means, write a book. You could make a lot of money. But ultimately it's assessing what is it in terms of, do they not know, or do they not care, or a bit of both, and then what else can we do to counteract that? And ultimately, again, sort of coming back to the Marie Kondo, like, you have many other things, I'm sure, in addition to this. So weighing it against those other areas and deciding, is this a fight you fight today? Or is it something that you save for later? Or maybe the fight, aka advocacy, looks a little different in a different place. So hopefully that is helpful. It is a messy situation, and I'm really sorry that you are in it. Both of those aspects are incredibly frustrating. And I'm very sorry that you're in that position. All right, I think that's about our time, but you're of course welcome to send a follow-up email if you have follow-up questions, or check out the YouTube channel for some of the other recordings that we covered a little earlier. Otherwise, just thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and we'll see you next month.